Hello and welcome. Hi, my name's Dave. Today we're going to build a flashcard app. It's designed to help learn multiplication tables. While we could use JavaScript, Python, or many other languages to build this application, today we're going to use PHP because it ties together the skills from my first 5 PHP videos in a playlist that I'll link to below. With this tutorial and any tutorial I make, my goal is to help you learn how to build the web. If you'd like to see more of that, click the subscribe button you see right over there in the corner. All right, let's get started. Let's set up our dev environment as we begin the project. We need the XAMPP control panel open, and if you don't have XAMPP installed, I'll leave a link in the comments below or in the description where you can find my tutorial for installing and setting up XAMPP. XAMPP will run this local dev server for us, and we need the Apache server running for PHP. So I'll click Start and go ahead and minimize that. I've got Visual Studio Code on the left side of the screen, and we're going to use Sass today as we write the CSS styles, and Sass will compile to CSS. If you don't have live Sass compiler, click the extensions icon in Visual Studio Code, and then search for live Sass, and you can see it's the second one right here, live Sass compiler. I'll click on that, and if you don't have that installed, click install, and you will want to have live Sass compiler running as we start out. And then I'll show you how to start the compiler as we start working on the Sass files. We'll start out first though with an index.php file. And I'm going to expand this screen. You can see what we're shooting for here, our form to start out the application, which will be a multiplication flashcards application. I'll expand that, and we're going to start out with what looks like a basic HTML page. But of course, this will be PHP when we're finished. And we've got the basic tags in here already. I use the emit extension. I can delete this and show you one more time. If you type an exclamation mark, or I said extension, it's an emit abbreviation, it will give you the skeleton of what you need in your HTML document to begin with. So for the document title, I'll type multiplication, there we go, flashcards, and I'll save that much with Control S. But let's see what I'm leaving out. I will come back and link to some Sass right here. But other than that, it looks like we can go ahead and start with the PHP. So the very first thing I'm going to do is open up a PHP tag at the top, and I'll close that out. And we will have a form, as you saw, to start out the app where we need to enter in a number if we want multiples of 10 or whatever number it is. And we will submit this form to the same page. So this is kind of a single page application where we will use includes to just change how the page looks in PHP. So we'll set this number variable that we will look for. If the form is submitted and we get a number, I'm going to use the filter input function, and it will be a get variable that the form submits. So we'll look for a get variable, and I'm just going to name it num for number. And then we're going to use filter sanitize number underscore int for integer. So that's what we're looking for. And we just set this variable at the top. Now, if it's not there, if we load the form or we load the page and we haven't submitted the form, this will return false. So number will be false if the form is not submitted. So we have that much. Now let's come down to the body of the page, and we'll start looking at includes. And we're going to build this page through includes. And the first one, well, let's go ahead and keep those lowercase. There we go. First one will be the header. And here I'm going to put a view folder. Now you can browse to the view folder. A dot indicates where you are. So this is the index file or the main folder, either way. / would mean you're going down into a folder. Now, oftentimes you see this omitted, and I do that with CSS too, but coming from JavaScript, I'm also used to adding that. So either way works. You could say /view for the view folder, or you could just say view. and it will know to go in that folder. Header.php is the file we're going to create in the view folder, and we will include that file and we'll end that line of PHP. Now let's go ahead while we're thinking of it and create the folder in the file tree. Here's the view folder, and now we can create header.php, and we'll come back and put some information in that. But right now let's just get the regular structure of the page. As you might guess, we will also have, and I'll just copy this, a footer. It's easy to just copy that line and change it out to footer. And I'll save that, highlight view in the file tree, and I'll go ahead and add a footer.php file as well. Coming back to the index, in between, we're going to have the results or the form. So I'll open a PHP tag, and I'll go ahead and put a closing one. And in between, we need to make a decision of what are we going to show on the page. So before I said this filter would return false or a number. And at this point, we can just look to see if this variable is empty, which is also false. We could put number. But since it returns false, we can, much like JavaScript, just say if this number exists, it either has a value or it is false. So we can just say if number, and then we can say if we have this number, we're going to include, once again, looking in the view folder, and we'll include results. But then we can also have an else clause, and there we can include the form. And there we have the full structure of our index.php, except for where we're going to have our link to our CSS. So let's go ahead and include that in the file tree as well. So create another new folder, name it CSS, and in the CSS folder, our file will be created for us when the Sass compiles. So we don't need to add that yet, but let's go ahead and add the link since we know what it will be, and it's going to be a style sheet. So we have link, the rel attribute, and it's a style sheet, and that's just says how it relates to this page. And then we have the href attribute, and that is where we link to it. Once again, this works the same way as I talked about the view. We could have a ./CSS to go into the folder, or you can just have CSS. And here I'll put main, and then I'm going to put .min because I have Live Sass compiler minifying the CSS. And that is a setting for Live Sass compiler. And then CSS, and that's a very common setting as well. And then we'll leave that there. Now, of course, our file, when we work on the Sass, will not be minified, but it will create a CSS file that is. Before we forget, let's go back to the view folder and create these other files we're going to need. So we need results.php, and then we also need form.php. Now that we have all the PHP files we need, let's start with the header, and this will be included on every instance of the page, whether we've loaded the results or the form. So we'll start out with the semantic element header, and inside there we'll put an h1 element, and this will of course be the only h1 on the page. You only want one h1 header per page. And here we'll link it to the index PHP, and that means it will reload the app for us without any parameters, so that would reload the form. And then we can type the title that we'll have in the header bar. This would be like a nav bar at the top, although we won't have a full menu there or anything. And this will just say multiplication, that's a big word, huh? Multiplication Flash Cards. There we go. Let's close out our link. There it is. And then close out the h1 element. and close out the header. And that is essentially the header for our page. Now let's look at the footer. We'll start the footer with the footer semantic element, and then we'll go ahead and add a class equals footer. And I'm not so sure I did that for the header, at least add the class, but I'll go back and check because I also wanted a class of header there. And now let's make some decisions with PHP. PHP, once again, with that number variable, we can just say if number, and from there we can decide what to put on the page. And then we'll have another PHP for the else. And let's close this one out, so that makes sense as well. And then we'll have a PHP to end the if-else, and then I'll put the contents in between. Let's just get rid of the else there, and we just end with that curly braces. And I left that squiggly out there. There we go. So we have our if number, and then something's going to happen, and then our else line, something else will happen, and then our curly brace to close out the if-else. So what's going to happen if number exists? Let's say we're going to say click here to show another number or choose another number. So once again, we'll link back to the index.php without any parameters, and that will show the form. So we'll say click here to pick another number. And that part's good to go. So at the bottom, the else, we were showing some rockets. So let me take this back to at least half the page, and I'll go ahead and expand the HTML page. Let's open up a new tab, and I'll search for Emojipedia. At Emojipedia, we're going to search for rocket. And here's rocket. Let's click on that. And you can see we can just copy a rocket emoji right in. So we'll go ahead and make this a little smaller again. And we can use our rocket emoji. It looks like we have 6 of those along the bottom. So we'll just paste 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And after I copied to paste, I'm just doing Control V. Once again, I'm on Windows. And that's what we will show if number is false, essentially. Okay, before I forget, let's go back to the header and add that class of header as well. And now let's go to the form and add the information that we'll see there in the form layout. So we'll start with main. This will be the main element, and also the results will have a main element. So it just depends which file gets included. Let's give this a class equal to main-entry. We're going to enter in information here. So use the word entry, and I'll close out the main form or the main element. Now let's put a subheading of H2, and I'll give this an ID of enter number, and here we'll say enter a number. Close out that H2, and from there let's add the form. We'll give this a class equal to main-entry 2 underscores and form. I'm using the BEM naming convention here, not strictly overall, but in this example, we're looking at the parent main entry, and then you put 2 underscores and the form just to say what we're working on is within this area of the page. And especially since we'll have 2 main elements depending on the include, this helps make our Sass and CSS make a little more sense. So there is the class. Now let's add an action. And this form action is going to use a PHP server variable that I've talked about in previous tutorials. So we start the PHP tag right here, and then we reference the server variables, and now we say which specific server variable it is, and it is PHP underscore self. And that means we're going to submit the form to this same page. It's the page that we're on. And that is why this index.php that we have will receive a number when the form is submitted. So we're submitting the form to itself, and after that we just need to say what method, and the method we're going to use is the get method. Let's go ahead and close out the form, and now we can put some information in between the form tags. Okay, the first thing we will have is an input, and I'm going to come down a line because there are so many attributes to add to this input. So the first one will be the class, and again we'll use that same naming convention, main entry, 2 underscores, and we'll just say input. After that, let's give it an ID, and we'll call it num, and then let's give it a name that should also match that. And when you're submitting a form, a name attribute is very important. Now notice we didn't put a label element to go with this input, so instead I'm going to use an aria-labeled by attribute, and this says enter number. So this is referring to the ID of the subheading where it says enter a number. So this input would be labeled, or the aria information for the input would say enter a number, which makes sense. It's a text input. Speaking of that, the next attribute is type equals text. Max length, well, let's set it to no more than 2. And then we'll put autofocus, so right when the page loads, it will put the focus into this text input. And then let's make this input required before the form can be submitted. And that also makes sense because we wouldn't have any results otherwise. So that closes out our input element. And now we need a button that will actually submit the form. We'll give this button a class of main-entry, 2 underscores, button. And we'll just give it text of go. And we'll close out the button. And that is the HTML and a little bit of PHP for our form. Now we have one more PHP file to complete, and that is the results PHP file. So here we will also have a main element, and we'll give this a class equal to main-results, and we'll give this an aria label. And the reason we'll give this an aria label is because otherwise, if we clicked in the results container, it would immediately read off all the cards, one right after the other, and we don't want that. So if we give it a label, it will just read the label for the element. So let's close out the main element. Now inside this element, we will not have a form, but we will start our PHP right away. We'll display the cards with PHP. Close the PHP tag. Now in between, let's go ahead and define a variable named cards, and let's set it to null. From there, let's build a for loop. So we'll say for, and then I equals 1. Instead of 0, we'll start this loop at 1, and then we'll have I less than or equal to 12. So we're going to look at flashcards of multiples of 1 through 12. And then we'll increment the I variable. Now inside the loop, let's go ahead and set a result variable, and that's going to be equal to the number if we have received a number and stored it in the number variable, times I, which is the integer that we increment every time the loop executes. So 1 through 12, that will give us multiples of 1 through 12. And then we can go ahead and start to add some information to cards. Now we defined cards at the top, so we've already got a null variable. So now we'll just say cards is equal to cards plus, or I'm sorry, we do dot equals, and this is like saying cards is equal to cards plus whatever new information. And since null is the first bit of information stored in cards, it won't show anything, but at the same time doing this prevents us from getting an error the first time that we try to assign cards with the dot equals. So now let's add some HTML in a string, We'll have a div, and the class is going to equal. Now we need to use single quotes inside because we're defining a string with double quotes. So I'm using single quotes where I would use quotes in the rest of this. And let's set a tab index equal to 0. So we could tab through the cards. And after that, let's do a line break, and I'll tab over. We'll set our ARIA label, and this is going to be equal to the number variable, and then it will say multiplied by, and now let's use the counter variable that we have of I, and then we'll say equals, and now let's read the result variable. And that should read like a sentence. When using a screen reader, which is what an ARIA label is for, it should say, for example, 10 multiplied by 1 equals 10. And that is for accessibility purposes. We'll close that tag out. And now let's add another div. And this div will have a class equal to card-front. And what will be in this div is the number variable, and we'll put an X 4 times. It's a traditional way to see that. And let's go ahead and put that counter variable again. And now we can close out that div. And now let's add another div. Give this a class equal to card back. It's the back side of the card. This will also need the same ARIA label we had before. Notice we didn't put it on card front. We put it on the full card because that's what will be selected if we were to tab through with the tab index. However, when the back side of the card is shown and we had to click on that, we'll flip the card over actually with CSS. But then if we click on that, we want it to read the same thing. We don't want it to just read the result. So let's go ahead and add this exact same ARIA tag here. And then on the next line, oh, I need to close that out. There we go, close out that element. Now on the next line, let's go ahead and put the result variable. And then we can close out this div. This would look a little bit better if we tab those in so we know where the div starts and ends. And now that we've closed out that div, we just need to close out the main div that started the whole thing above. And that is the end of our string. So what we have done is created a container div, and within it, the container div is the card class. And then within this container div, we have 2 other divs, and the one div has the card front and the other div has the card back. So once we've created this string, and it creates a new one each time the loop executes, and then when the loop is complete, we'll just echo cards because this variable holds all of the cards that were created. It is defined before the loop, and then it's continually added to during the loop, and at the very end it holds all the cards, and we will echo that to the screen. So let's save that, and we've completed our results PHP. Now let's go ahead and style the pages. I will make this take up a little less space. Now we have this here. I'll close out the Emojipedia tab. Let's open another tab, and instead of looking at the example, we'll actually look at the one we're creating now. Have localhost / and I believe I called this flash _ cards, and it probably isn't going to look too good right now. Nope, we just have our content. We don't really have any of the style. So here we can go ahead and even enter in a number, click go, and we get all the content that we would expect on the results page as well, but it's definitely not flashcards at this point. It's just looking like pure plain old HTML. But we know we have everything working, and we've got the information working back and forth between the views as well. So now let's go ahead and start styling. I also want to go ahead and open DevTools and look at the phone view, because it's always best to style from the smallest to the largest, even though I like this app, especially for children in a larger computer screen. I want it to work on mobile devices. And as a matter of fact, my kids use iPads all the time, so that would also make sense. So we'll start with a smaller screen. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use Live Sass compiler. So once again, go to that extension, make sure you have Live Sass compiler installed. And I'm going to create one more folder over here, and we'll name this Sass. And by the way, if you like my icons, that's VS Code-icons. You can also search for here, -icons. And you can go ahead and install this version of VS Code-icons, and you'll get the Sass icons and PHP and so on. Okay, so with the Sass, we need to start creating the different files here. And the main one that I always start out with is main.scss. Even though it is Sass, I like to use the SCSS version of Sass. So we'll have that. And all I'm going to do in this main file is import the other partials. And the other files are called partials that contain the information that you import in to make one larger eventual compiled CSS file. So the first file I usually start out with on smaller projects, and even probably on larger projects for that matter, would be colors. And then I'm going to import some Sass mixins. And if you're not familiar with that, you'll see what those are soon. And after that, I'll import the base, and we'll come back after this much and probably add some more imports. But let's start with those. So I need to add a colors file. Every partial file name needs to start with an underscore. You don't have to list the underscore when you import, but you need to tell Sass that it is a partial by starting the file with an underscore. So I have underscore colors.scss. And here we can define color variables, and they're handy because then you can change the actual color in one spot and just leave the variables throughout your definitions. So I'm going to use 3 E's here for the hex code. For the body background, I'm going to define a header background variable, and I'm going to use 3 3's for that hex code. And then the header color is going to be a pure white, which is 3 F's. And then card background is going to be Dodger blue. I'm actually using a color name for that. And then the shadow that we'll put on the cards is going to be a large shadow. It gives it kind of a floating appearance. So 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, and then RGBA, so we can actually use some transparency here. 0, 0, looks like I'm running out of room. I'll go ahead and expand this for the time being. 0, and then 0.2, so fairly transparent. And then the go button color, I'm going to use another color name there, lime green. And that is our colors file. Now the next file we imported, mixins. So let's go ahead and create a mixins file. So underscore mixins.scss. And we're going to define a couple of mixins. And this helps keep our code dry. Dry is an acronym, and that stands for don't repeat yourself. So there are blocks of code that I have to add to more than one element or class, and I just don't want to type all the lines when we can define it much faster, or at least reuse it much faster after we define it once inside of a mixin. So flex center, this is where I'm going to have a display equal to flex, and then we want to center the content. So I say justify content equals center, and then align items equals center. Now instead of having to type those 3 lines in the future, I'll just have to refer to flex center, and we'll get all of that code at once. The other mixin I'm going to define is for media queries. So I'll just call this MQ, and we'll have a size variable here. And from there, inside this mixin, we'll say at media only, which is truly like a media query now. But we only have to type this out this one time. And let's set the min width equal to that size variable. And now we can just say at content and save that. And then we'll use this in the future for media queries. And that is our mixins file. Now let's check our main file again, and we've imported the base. So let's go ahead and add the base styles file. And we just call that underscore base.scss. This file contains the very base for the foundation of the other styles, essentially what you start a page out with that gets inherited later. So this would have like the CSS reset and our font size that we start with and things like that. And speaking of font, the first thing we need to do now for this file is grab the font. So I'll once again expand this page, open a new page here and go to fonts.google.com. And we're going to use a fairly common font, and it's so common it's the first one that popped up here. It's Roboto. If we click on that, we scroll down, there's various options here as far as how bold and thick the font is. And there's 900 italic or 900. We don't want italic, I don't think. Well, maybe, yeah, let's go with italic. Let's go ahead and do that. So we just click select this style. Now we could select these links and use this in our index PHP, or we can go ahead and select this at import rule and use it in our CSS. So let's go ahead and use the import rule, and we don't need the style elements either. That would go in the index. We just need the at import rule itself. And then notice below, I've copied this much, notice below it says font family Roboto in single quotes, and then a fallback of sans serif. So we've got this ready to go. Now let's go back to our base file, and at the very top of this base.scss, I'm just going to paste in that full import line. It's a little long. It even makes me scroll when we have the full page out. But here it is, at import URL, and we're importing this font right into our essentially CSS, but we're using an SCSS that will be compiled to CSS later. So once we've done that, I'll go ahead and save. We can start with our CSS reset, and that's margin of 0, padding of 0, and then we set box sizing to border box. That enables us to just keep the padding and margin definitions all within the size of an element when we're setting the width, the height. The margin is actually outside. It's the padding and border, that are included on the inside. And we can look at that on a page really quickly. Let's go back to our multiplication flashcard. Let's go to the one that is completed, my example. If I right-click the button and pull up the styles for this, I'll pull this up. If we scroll down in DevTools all the way down here, all the way down, there we go. Here's the box model. And you can see the border. Looks like I need to drag this over just a little to show the full thing. The border is included in the box. The padding is included. And here's the actual content. The margin is not included. And you can see in the page over here, it will show the margin outside of the element. And that's a 20. And that is what setting the box sizing does for us. Instead of keeping all of those things separately, now we can kind of calculate all of that except for the margin into one. Okay, back to setting the rest of these default base styles. We're going to set the HTML element. It is the root element of the page, so this is where we'll set the font size, and everything else can be based off of this, especially if we use REM units after this. And then we'll use a font family, and this is where we define just what we got from Google. We say Roboto, and then the fallback was sans serif. Now the body element will contain everything else, but it's not the root element of the page. So it's important sometimes for something like font size to set that on the root element, where the root EM or REM unit always refers back to that. Here's the width of the page, 100% of the body. The minimum height of the page, 100 viewport units. Background, body background. Now we include a mixin. This is where I would have had to type all those other lines that were in that flex center mixin, but I can just type @include and put the mixin there. Now let's set the flex direction here to column so it stacks. The default for a flex box is row. And then the padding on the bottom of the body to 60 pixels, and that gives enough room for our footer that we're going to lock into place. And that is the end of the base file. With this much saved, let's go ahead and activate the live Sass compiler. Notice at the bottom of my screen I've got Watch Sass right here. If I click this Watch Sass, it says working on it, and now it opened up a window at the bottom of my Visual Studio Code. I'm on the Output tab instead of the Terminal tab, and it says it's watching. That also means if we look in our CSS folder now, it has automatically created this main.min.css. It's also creating this map file by default, but you don't need to worry about the map file, and we won't use it. The minified CSS has been created, and we can actually close this window out, and live Sass compiler will continue to work. The minified CSS, you can see, is all one long line. It removes all the unnecessary breaks and spaces, and it just minifies it to make it a smaller file. But we can still look at the individual code that we create here in the main CSS. So let's pull this back and look at our page. If we reload it, and we don't have any media queries, so it's still pretty large for a phone right now. I'll close out DevTools, and here we can see what we've got now. I'll enter in the number 10 again, press enter, it should work. And we still have pretty much a basic page, but those initial base styles have now been applied. Let's go back to our base file and add the other files that we will import and create. So the next file I just called header footer, and as you might guess, it has the styles for the header and the footer in it. After that, import for entry, and remember we had a main entry section, and that was for the form entry or form input. And then the last one, of course, is the results. Let's save those. And now I got an error when I saved right away because Sass is running and it is looking for those files that don't yet exist, but we'll create them and then that problem will go away. So the next thing we need to do is create that header footer file. Oh, it needs to start with an underscore. I almost forgot. It's a header footer partial.scss. And we'll start with the header class at the top. This header class is going to have a position of sticky. And that's because we want the header to stay there. Even if we scroll, we want things to scroll underneath it. And for position sticky to work, we need to set a top value, and we set that to 0. And then we'll set the Z index to 1, so the header stays on top of the other content that scrolls underneath. And once again, I got an error, and I'm probably going to every time until I create those other files. So let's just go ahead and create those other files, even though they'll be empty. We'll go ahead and create the entry.scss, and we'll create the results.scss. Let's close that out, and we'll come back to the header footer file now. Now for the header class and for the footer class, and we can just put a comma between those. We can set the background to header-bg. Set the color to header-color. Set the font size 0.5 rem. And if you remember, we set the root font size to 42 pixels, so 0.5 would be 24 pixels. Now let's set the width to 100%, so it spans the page. We'll set the minimum height for the header to 60 pixels, and we'll text align to center. So that will be inherited by, for example, the H1 element inside the header, or whatever we might put that would also use this property inside the footer. We'll save both of those. And now I'm going to define a title-break. And this is because our title of the page, Multiplication Flash Cards, is going to be too wide to fit well on a mobile screen. So I'll just put display block here for that for now. And we're going to show and hide a break to make it read just a little bit better on the page. Moving on to the footer class, we'll set a position of fixed. This will be a fixed footer that we'll keep at the bottom of the page, but we also want the information to scroll underneath it like the top, but we can't do sticky because we're not exactly sure how large we want the footer to be. And likewise, you have to position it just a little bit different. We can't stick it to the bottom so much as we can do a fixed position. So here we'll put the top, and we have to use the calc function and say 100 viewport height units minus 60 pixels. So we kind of plan on it being 60 pixels. There's the left over to the absolute left as well. So we'll set that left to 0. And now we'll include the flex center. And we'll set a font size in the footer to 0.6 rem. Now the header and the footer will have a couple of media queries. And if you remember, that mixin we defined for the media queries was MQ, so we'll include the MQ and we'll say it's 768 pixels, and we set that mixin to use a minimum width, so that's what we're doing. At a minimum width of 768, which is iPad size, here's the header class. We'll set the font size a little larger. Now it's 1 rem, which would be the 42 pixels, and the footer, we won't set it as large as that, but we will increase it just a little bit. We'll say 0.8 rem. Now one more media query, and this will be for that title break we referenced. So we'll say at include MQ. Now we're up at iPad Pro size. So this is where we will hide the break. Once the page is at least 1024 pixels wide, we know it won't have an awkward wrap, so we can just remove that line break, and we'll set the display to none. Now while I'm thinking of it, let's go ahead and put that break in the page. Back in the header PHP file, we just need to go right here and we'll say BR, just the element. And we'll set that class equal to title-break and close out the BR. And once we save that, now it will have this line break on any page that is not at least 1024 pixels wide. With those styles defined, let's go ahead and pull our page over again and reload. And our page looks different. It's not exactly where we want it yet, but we've got something going there. Put the number 10 in, and here we go. And you can see the multiplication flashcards at the top. We've got our footer at the bottom, and everything scrolls underneath it like we want it to as well. So this page with the results is coming together maybe a little bit better than the form right now. Now let's go ahead and put the styles into the entry. This is for the form that we see here. And the first thing you'll notice is that we do not have the header at the top. we haven't set our main area to grow yet as a flex box, but we will do that and it will push to the top and of course to the bottom of the page and leave the center area for the form. So we will start, I'll go ahead and expand this again to have the room, with the main-entry class. We'll set the width to 100%, display flex, and flex direction will be column. And then we need to set flex grow equal to 1, and that's what will let it grow and expand and have that header at the top and footer at the bottom. And after that we'll do justify content, and instead of center here we'll say flex start. So the form will actually be closer to the top of the page, or closer to the header than it is the footer. It won't be in the exact middle. We'll say align items center though. And from there we'll go ahead and set the font size 0.5 REM. So starting out, this would once again be, if our font size was 42 pixels, this would be 21 pixels that we set. And then margin top 1 REM. We can save that. Let's go ahead and look at the page now just to see the difference. We'll need to reload. And yes, it pushed to the top and the bottom just like I expected it to, because this flex area has the flex grow set on that. From there, we'll do the main-entry 2 underscores form. Here we'll include that flex center mixin once again, but the flex direction needs to be column here as well. If we save that, now you can see it made everything stack. So our go button went from being on the right to underneath. So we've stacked these elements. Now this will be for main-entry 2 underscores, oops, input, and main-entry 2 underscores button. So both of these elements will receive these styles. And we have to do this because input elements do not get some of the default styles and do not inherit them that other elements do. So we're actually redefining some things here that otherwise would be inherited. So we're saying font family Roboto, default back to sans serif, and font size 1 rem, letter spacing. Just do this to make it look a little better. 0.05 EM. Now that is not a root EM, that is a regular EM, so it will relate to the font size on the element itself. So it relates to this font size here. Now we have padding, set that 0.25 EM. Border radius, 15 pixels. Width, a set value of 100 pixels. Height, 73 pixels. We'll text align, center, and the top margin, margin-top, 20 pixels. Save that and refresh, and you can see it looks a little different now. Now let's add a couple of styles just for that button. So it will be main-entry 2 underscores button. Need 2 T's as well. There we go. And now we'll say background. We set this variable for the go dash button, and then we'll have the color, and we'll use what we already set for the header color there. We save that and refresh. You can see now we've got our green button with the white font. Now we'll define a couple of focus pseudo styles here. So main entry, input, focus. So when that input has focus, and the same thing with main entry, button focus. We'll set the outline to none. but then we need to add something. If we set the outline to none, there needs to be some other way to tell that it has focus. So we'll set a box shadow. Let's reload this again. Now this has a box shadow because it has focus. Or if we go to the button, it has the shadow. And again, it is a very big shadow and it is very transparent, but it gives it kind of a lifted off the page look when we do that. And now there's one media query that we need to set in this file before we're finished. So we'll use our mixin we defined before of MQ. This is for 768 pixels. And for the main dash entry, we can increase the font size once we reach 768 pixels to 1 rem. And then for the main dash entry, 2 underscores input and main dash entry, 2 underscores button, we will change a few things as it gets larger. We'll set a font size of 2 rems. We'll set a width of 200 pixels and we'll set a height of 150 pixels. And that finishes that file. Let's go ahead and reload and let's enter in a number. And everything pretty much looks the same on the results page because we're working on the form page. But if we go back, the form page looks good, except right now these links for header and footer are still the wrong color. So let me check that file. We might have missed something. And I believe we did miss something. Right after the footer and before the media queries, we need to add header class and then the anchor link. So any anchor link inside the header class, and likewise footer class and the anchor, I said link element, but yes, use anchors for links. So here I'll put color equals header dash color, and let's put text decoration none, which will remove the lines underneath. And now let's refresh the page. Now we have exactly what I expected in the header, and we'll put in the number 5 just to see the multiplication. And then the header and the footer look like the right color after that. Now if we open up DevTools, our page that we're working on looks correct in the smaller screens. So the phone looks great. This, of course, doesn't look quite like what we expect yet. We need to put in the style for our flashcards. Everything else looks pretty much like it should. So we need to add just a little bit of CSS magic through some animation to have our flashcards flip over and flip back on the results page, and then our app will be complete. Let's go ahead and get out of DevTools here so we can see the full page. And now I'll bring this back to a half size just so we can come over and look at it occasionally. But I'm going to expand this all the way now, and let's look at the results partial that we can add our definitions to here for styles. So I'll start with main-results, set the width to 100%. We'll include our flex center mixin. We'll set the flex wrap now because we'll have rows of cards that, yes, we do want those to wrap. And we'll set the flex grow to 1. So once again, this main results page will grow and push the header and footer to where they need to be. Now let's set a card class. If you remember, the card is the container. If we look at the results PHP quickly, we define this container card, and inside the container class of card will be the card front and the card back. So right now we're putting styles on the card itself. So this card class is going to have a width of 22%. Let's give it a minimum width though of 150 pixels, a minimum height of 100 pixels, the background of transparent. This means we'll set the colors themselves on the card front and back because they'll have different colors rather than on the card container. We'll set the color to the header color for the font. And now the font size will be 1 rem. Padding will be 1 em. So this is going to relate to whatever the font size is within the element, unlike an rem that relates back to the root element. 0.25 em for the margin. Outline, say 0, I believe it's none. Position, relative. Now, while we have this position relative, that means we'll put absolute positioned elements within, but now we need to set the transition for the animation. So transition will be transform 0.6 seconds, and then we'll set ease in and out. And now for the transform style, we'll set preserve 3D, because this does need to be 3D for the card to flip and look correctly. We actually have to work with what would be more the 3D space than just looking at something in 2D. So now let's also go ahead and set hover and focus styles for the card container. So here's card hover, here's card focus. I'll say transform, rotate Y 180 degrees. And that means we're going to flip the card over when we hover over the card or when we have focus on the card. Now for the card front and for the card back, they will share some styles. They'll both be positioned absolute, and we had to have the container be positioned relative, here it is, for that to work. So we have a relative container, so within we can position those absolute. Now to be positioned absolute, we have to give them a place to be. So we say top 0 and left 0. We'll have them fill the full width of the container, the full height of the container. Now this is kind of the property that makes the whole 3D card flip view work, and this is called back face visibility. And we'll put hidden for now. And then let's go ahead and give the cards, the front and the back, a shadow. If we just put the shadow on the container, when the card flips, it has the shadow on the wrong side. So you need to put it on the front and the back, and so the shadow stays on the same side, or it's kind of strange. You might not even be able to put your finger on what's off, but something seems off. So this takes care of that. Now for the card front itself, let's have a background of card BG, and if you remember right, that's our Dodger blue. And let's go ahead and put that flex center. There we go. And I'll scroll up a little so we can see more, and we'll put the card back definitions as well. We'll set that background to the header color, which if you remember is white, and then the color itself will say header background. So we're just kind of inversing those colors, and that is more of a flat black. Now the transform animation here is to be rotate Y 180 degrees. And we also want to include our flex center mix in here. Before we finish, let's add a couple of media queries also. Say include media query 768 pixels for the card container, we'll say the width can be now 300, so a little bit larger card, and a font size of 2 rims. One more media query to add, and this is just when we get up to iPad Pro size, a little bit larger actually than iPad Pro size, so we're looking at desktops here. We'll say dot card once again. We'll just get the card just a little bit bigger to 350 pixels. And at this point we can say they're 175 pixels tall. Let's save that and now bring this back over and reload the page. And now if we put in, say, 5, we get our cards. And if we hover over the card, it flips. The shadow stays on the same side too, notice. That's great. Now we can also click, which will give the card focus, and then it stays open until we go to another card. Now hovering flips that card while this is still open, but if we click on the card, it closes. And if we click anywhere in the container that's not on a card, that card flips back over or closes as well. So we'll expand this, and we can even reload, because when you reload, you still have the get parameter in the address. So the only way to load the page now without a parameter in the address is to click the header or the footer where it tells you to, and it will come back, and now there is no parameter here at all. And you can just enter in another number, and there we go. One other thing I would like to do now that we've completed the app, because you noticed the ARIA labels we added, let's go ahead and open up Chrome extensions by opening up the 3-dot menu, going to More Tools, Extensions, scroll down. It now, instead of saying Chrome Vox, it just says Screen Reader, so that's fine too. I'll activate that.
Chrome Vox spoken feedback is ready.
And here's our page.
Web view. Multiplication flashcards. Enter a number. Edit text.
Seems to be working. I can enter in the number 10.
1, 0.
I can press enter.
Web view. Multiplication flashcards. Multiplication flashcards. Link.
Okay, now I can tab through.
10. 10.
Okay, we have something not working with our cards.
10x1. 10. 10.
Because it's saying 10 on every card. So we need to check and see what that issue is. We will look back at our results PHP. I'll go ahead and expand this so I can see the full thing. And yes, I can see the problem right away. We had the ARIA label, but we didn't put a quote at the beginning. And that's probably the same here because we copied it down. So now we start the label attribute and end the attribute with a quote. Let's save that. Let's go
10.
back to our page.
Web view. Multiplication flashcards. Go. Enter a number. 0. Web view. Multiplication flashcards. Multiplication flashcards. Link. 10 multiplied by 1 equals 10. 10 multiplied by 2 equals 20. 10 multiplied by 3 equals 30. 10 multiplied by 4 equals 40. 10 multiplied by 12 equals 120.
Now everything seems to be working as expected. Congratulate yourself. Today we've built a useful application with PHP that ties together many of the basic features we've learned about. If you'd like to challenge yourself, now create this same application in another language you're familiar with, like JavaScript or Python. There's always more to learn. Some of the videos on the left may help you on your coding journey. Thank you for watching and subscribing, and I'll see you next time.